I woke up because something was pulling my leg. Not metaphorically. Something had clamped around my left ankle and was dragging me across a surface that ground against my back armor like a belt sander. I could feel the vibration in my teeth, in my skull, in the base of my spine where the suit's dampening gel had ruptured and gone cold. I tried to scream. My lungs were full of smoke. I coughed instead, a long, racking convulsion that tasted like copper and burned polymer. And then I was rolling, tumbling off an edge, falling for one sickening second before slamming into something flat and warm. Deck plating. I was still on a ship. The dragging stopped. I heard footsteps, not Vayneth footsteps, which ring on metal like struck bells because of the calcium ridges on our feet, but something softer, heavier, a muffled thud, 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 rhythmic as a heartbeat. I opened my left eye. The right one was sealed shut with dried blood. The shape above me was wrong. Too broad in the shoulders, too narrow in the waist. The proportions of something that had been assembled from parts that didn't know they belonged together. A human. It was wearing a suit I didn't recognize, matte gray, no insignia, scarred across the chest plate by something that had tried very hard to cut through and failed. Its helmet was off. Its face was, I remember thinking this with absolute clarity. Even through the fog, its face was tired. Not triumphant, not cruel, not the face of something that had just destroyed the most powerful battle fleet in 300 light years. Just tired. It said something. Its translator was clipped to its collar, and the device spat out Vayneth words with that strange, flat cadence human translators always produce, as if the language is a thing to be survived rather than spoken. "Can you breathe?" I stared at it. "Can you breathe?" it said again. Not a question the second time. A diagnostic. I managed a nod. It reached down and did something to my suit's chest panel. I flinched, but it had already finished. Atmosphere hissed in from a portable canister it had mag-locked to my sternum. The air tasted different, cleaner. Too much oxygen for Vayneth lungs, but breathable. "Don't move," it said. "Your dorsal plate is cracked in 2 places, and I don't know enough about your anatomy to guess what's underneath." Then it stood, turned, and walked into the smoke to find the next one. That was 12 hours after the battle. 12 hours after the entire Vayneth 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, 431 warships, the pride of the Ascendancy, crewed by 250,000 of the finest soldiers our civilization had produced in 8 generations, ceased to exist as a military formation in 11 minutes and 14 seconds. My name is Kael Vorethan. I held the rank of Shield Lieutenant in the Vayneth Naval Ascendancy, assigned to the Imperishable, a Sovereignty-class dreadnought, one of only 9 ever built. The Imperishable carried a crew of 4,200. It was armed with enough firepower to crack a planet's mantle. It had served for 47 years without a single engagement loss. 11 minutes. Not 11 minutes of battle, understand? Not the kind of engagement where advantage shifts and formations buckle, and the outcome becomes clear over time as one side accumulates leverage. 11 minutes from the moment the human fleet dropped out of transit to the moment there was nothing left to shoot at. I've been asked by historians, by intelligence analysts, by the families of the dead to explain what happened, to describe the battle, to reconstruct, from my perspective as a surviving officer, the tactical and strategic reality of that engagement. Here is the truth. I cannot describe the battle because I do not understand what happened. None of us do. 11 minutes is not enough time to form a coherent picture from inside the target area. It is barely enough time to understand you are dying. I have fragments, impressions, a shattered window through which I saw something I was not built to process. But I can describe everything else. I can describe the 9 days in Wreckage, drifting in a field of broken ships, breathing recycled air while human search teams moved through the debris, pulling Vayneth soldiers from compartments we couldn't reach. I can describe the faces of my crewmates when they understood that the species we'd come to exterminate was the one handing them water. I can describe what it felt like to have every truth I'd been raised on annihilated more thoroughly than our fleet. This is not a battle account. This is the story of what happens after you lose everything and the enemy refuses to let you die. You need to understand what the Vayneth Ascendancy was, or none of what follows will make sense. We were the dominant military civilization in the Orion Cygnus Bridge, a corridor of settled space roughly 900 light-years long, containing 41 inhabited systems and 7 client species who existed within our sphere of protection. Protection is the word the Ascendancy used. Other species had other words for it. Our culture was built on a single foundational premise: strength is identity. From the moment a Veneth child could walk, we were measured, ranked, and sorted. Martial aptitude determined social standing, professional assignment, reproductive rights, residential allocation. The strongest served on warships. The competent served in administration. The weak served in labor tiers, and their children began their lives one rung lower than their parents. This was not cruelty, as we understood it. It was honesty. The universe was hostile. Resources were finite. The species that survived was the species that ensured its strongest members held its most critical positions. To pretend otherwise, to elevate compassion over capability, sentiment over function, was to invite extinction. We had 7 client species because we had conquered 7 species. We administered them because we were stronger. They served because the alternative was destruction. This was not ideology, it was physics. Mass dictates orbit. Humans were the 8th. They had been in our awareness for approximately 30 standard years. A young species, freshly interstellar, occupying a handful of systems at the trailing edge of the Orion Cygnus Bridge. Our intelligence assessments classified them as a mid-tier emerging civilization, industrious, adaptable, technologically competent but not exceptional. Their ships were crude by our standards. Their weapons were a generation behind. Their fleet was small. The decision to bring them into the client structure was made by the Grand Admiralty 4 years before the battle, and it was considered so routine that it was assigned to the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet as a readiness exercise. We were not the Ascendancy's best fleet. We were the fleet that needed operational hours. Conquering humanity was our training mission. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 431 warships, 250,000 personnel, 9 Sovereignty-class dreadnoughts, the largest military deployment against an alien species in 11 years. And it was practice. I remember the briefings. I remember the intelligence summaries projected onto the tactical wall of the Imperishable's war room, human ship silhouettes rendered in blue, capabilities annotated in precise Vaneth military notation. Their largest warship was approximately 1/3 the mass of our smallest escort frigate. Their weapon systems operated on principles we had surpassed decades ago. Their defensive technology was, by our assessment, negligible. Fleet Commander Terrace Vone stood at the front of that room and said, "This engagement is an administrative action. The humans will be offered terms. If they refuse, suppression will require less than 1 rotation. Plan accordingly." No one questioned this. Why would we? We were Vaneth. I should tell you about Resk. Resk Nathri was my cabin mate on the Imperishable, a shield ensign 2 years my junior. He was too young for his rank, everyone knew it, including him. But his family had produced admirals for 6 generations, and in the Ascendancy, lineage opened doors that competence alone could not. He was not a bad officer. He was an anxious one. He checked his equipment 3 times before every shift. He asked questions in briefings that others thought were obvious. He kept a small hollow image of his younger sister tucked inside his duty locker and thought I didn't know about it. I mention Resk because he said something during the transit to human space that I dismissed at the time and have not stopped thinking about since. We were in the mess hall, 3 days from the target system. The mood was relaxed pre-engagement confidence, the kind that fills a warship when the crew believes the outcome is predetermined. Resk was eating slowly, pushing his rations around the tray in that methodical way of his, and he looked up at me and said, "Have you read the cultural annexes?" I hadn't. Cultural annexes were supplementary intelligence documents, background on the target species' social structures, art, communication patterns. They were included in the briefing packages for post-conquest administration, not for combat officers. Why would I read the cultural annexes? Resk set down his utensil. They've been interstellar for less than 80 years, Kael, and they've already fought 6 wars against each other. That's not unusual for a young species. 6 wars with nuclear weapons. They used atomic fire on their own cities, their own civilians, twice. I shrugged. Barbarism. Further evidence they need administration. Resk shook his head slowly and said something I've carried in my chest like a stone for 3 years. Any species that survives doing that to itself is not a species that's afraid of pain. I laughed. He didn't. The human system was called Arcturus, not their home system. They had enough strategic awareness to keep their homeworld's location out of any database we could access, but a major colony hub. 3 inhabited worlds, extensive orbital infrastructure, approximately 2 billion residents. We dropped out of transit at the system's edge in standard conquest formation. Dreadnoughts at center, heavy cruisers in layered screens, escort frigates in outer picket. 431 ships stretching across 300,000 kilometers of space. The formation alone was designed to communicate inevitability. When a species saw that wall of metal, they understood. Resistance was geometry, and the geometry was against them. Fleet Commander Vone transmitted the standard terms: surrender of military assets, acceptance of administrative oversight, integration into the client structure. Compliance would be met with preservation. Resistance would be met with sterilization. We waited. The response came in 11 seconds. Not from a government channel or a military frequency, but on an open broadband transmission, unencrypted, as if they wanted everyone in the system to hear it. A single word in accented but grammatically perfect Veneth. No. Then the human fleet arrived. I need to be precise here because the sequence of events has been distorted by propaganda on both sides. The human fleet did not emerge from behind a planet. It did not decloak. It did not appear from some hidden dimension or unknown transit technology. It dropped out of standard faster-than-light transit at 7 points simultaneously, in a pattern that our tactical systems initially classified as random. It was not random. 23 ships, against our 431. I was on the Imperishable's secondary bridge, the Damage Control Coordination Center, when the contacts appeared on the tactical display. I remember the murmur that went through the room. Not alarm, amusement. Some of the officers laughed. 23 ships. Many of them were smaller than our frigates. Only 3 were what we'd classify as capital scale, and even those were less than half the tonnage of a Sovereignty-class dreadnought. Sub-Commander Vithari, who ran the damage control station, leaned over to me and said, "I almost feel sorry for them." 20 seconds later, every alarm on the ship went off simultaneously. I cannot give you a coherent tactical narrative of what followed. I've tried. In 3 years of debriefings, reconstructions, and therapy, I've tried to assemble the fragments into a sequence that makes sense. Here is what I know. The human ships moved wrong. That is the only way I can describe it. Every naval engagement I had studied, every simulation I had trained in, every tactical doctrine I had learned operated on a shared assumption that warships are massive objects governed by momentum, limited by inertia, constrained by the physics of their own tonnage. You could predict where a ship would be because you knew what it weighed and how fast it could change direction. The human ships did not behave as if they were aware of these constraints. They didn't dodge our fire. That implies a reactive posture. You see the incoming, you move. What the humans did was never be where the fire arrived. Their trajectories were a causal to our targeting systems. They were not evading, they were already elsewhere. As if they had run our firing solutions before we had, plotted the exact cone of danger, and built their approach around the negative space. Our weapons hit vacuum, over and over and over. 431 ships pouring fire into emptiness, while 23 shapes moved through us like water through fingers. Then they started firing back. The Ascending Virtue, a heavy cruiser on our port screen, was the first to die. I watched it on the tactical display. One moment it was there, a healthy green icon, all systems nominal. The next moment it was yellow, then red, then gone. Not destroyed in the conventional sense, not blown apart by sequential impacts that degraded shields and then hull. It was there, and then it was unmade, as if something had reached in and convinced the atoms in its hull that they no longer wished to be a ship. That was at the 40-second mark. By the 2-minute mark, we had lost 60 ships. By the 5-minute mark, we had lost 200. I remember the sound on the secondary bridge. Not the alarms, those had become a constant, meaningless wail. The sound underneath. The silence between officers who had run out of orders to give. The soft click of someone unstrapping from their station. The breathing. The Imperishable died at the 9-minute mark. I don't know what hit us. The hull breach was on the port side, decks 7 through 15. Atmosphere vented in a direction I could feel through the deck plating a shudder. then a pull, then a crack that traveled through the superstructure like a living thing. I was thrown into a bulkhead. My visor shattered. Something cut my face open from my right temple to my jaw. I tasted blood and smoke and the sharp chemical flavor of ruptured coolant lines. Then the lights went out. When emergency power activated 6 seconds later, Sub-Commander Vathari was dead at her station, a structural beam through her chest. 2 of my damage control team were gone, sucked through the breach before the emergency bulkhead sealed. The tactical display was dark. I crawled to the nearest functioning console and pulled up external sensors. The fleet was gone. Not retreating, not scattered, gone. The tactical plot that had shown 431 green icons now showed a field of debris signatures, expanding gas clouds and radiation blooms. Here and there, a handful of yellow icon ships like the Imperishable, gutted but not quite dead, tumbling through the wreckage of their formation. 23 human ships sat motionless in the void, undamaged, waiting. 11 minutes and 14 seconds. The Imperishable did not have engines. It did not have weapons. It had emergency power on 9 of its 32 decks, partial life support on 6, and approximately 1,100 survivors out of 4,200 crew. We were, by any military definition, dead. We simply hadn't stopped breathing yet. I gathered what remained of my damage control team, 4 officers and 19 enlisted. And we began the work of keeping the ship habitable, not repairable, habitable. There is a difference. Repairable implies a future where the ship functions again. Habitable means the air stays breathable long enough for the survivors to die of something other than asphyxiation. I am being precise because precision is the only thing I had left. We sealed breached compartments. We rerouted atmosphere from sections with no survivors to sections with survivors. We found the medical bay on Deck 4 mostly intact and carried the wounded there on improvised stretchers made from hull paneling. Dr. Mylith, the Imperishable's chief surgeon, a woman who had never once in 20 years of service treated a combat casualty, because the Ascendancy never lost, worked for 14 straight hours without speaking, her hands steady, her face empty. I found Resk on Deck 11. He was pinned under a collapsed support strut in what had been an auxiliary targeting room. The strut had crushed his legs. He was conscious. When I reached him, he was holding the hollow image of his sister, studying it with a focus that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "Kael," he said. His voice was conversational, calm. The targeting room recorded external data until the power failed. I watched the last 4 minutes. I tried to move the strut. It weighed more than I could shift alone. "They didn't target life support," he said. I stopped. "I watched the engagement data, Kael. Every ship they killed, they hit drives, weapons, power cores, command decks, military infrastructure. The targeting was..." He paused, and something passed across his face that I'd never seen on a Vaneth officer. It was surgical. They were disabling us. The deaths were structural, collateral. They were not trying to kill the crews. "That's not possible," I said. "At that speed, at that scale." I watched it. 4 minutes of high-resolution data. They killed our ships and they tried to leave the people alive. I thought about that for a long time, crouched beside my friend in the dark of a broken room. Then I went to find someone to help me lift the strut. The human ships made contact 16 hours after the battle. They did not demand surrender. They did not issue terms. They broadcast a single message on the Vaneth emergency frequency, translated into flawless Ascendancy standard. "To all surviving Vaneth personnel, we are deploying search and rescue teams. They will be unarmed. They will enter your vessels to provide medical assistance, restore life support, and evacuate critically wounded. If you do not wish to be boarded, transmit on this frequency and we will drop supplies at your hull. No one is required to accept our presence. No one will be forced." I stood on the secondary bridge of the Imperishable, surrounded by the surviving officers, and listened to that message repeat 3 times. Silence. Then someone I never learned who transmitted our deck plan and casualty count. The first human team arrived on the Imperishable 40 minutes later. There were 6 of them. They came through the hull breach on Deck 7 in a shuttle so small it looked like a lifeboat. They wore the same matte gray suits I would later see on the one who dragged me across the deck plating. No weapons visible. Each one carried a heavy pack. I would later learn these contained modular life support units, medical supplies, and emergency rations formulated for Vaneth biology. Formulated for Vaneth biology. They had brought food we could eat. This detail still stops me when I think about it. They had come to this system knowing they would fight us, knowing they would win, and they had packed their rescue shuttles with nutrition synthesized to match our specific metabolic requirements. This was not improvisation. This was not mercy discovered in the moment. They had planned for our survival before the first shot was fired. The team leader was a woman named Sergeant An Dao. I know her name because she introduced herself to every Vaneth she encountered, formally and carefully, using the ascendancy honorific structure with a precision that suggested she had studied it rather than simply been programmed with it. She was short by human standards. The top of her head barely reached my chest, with dark hair pulled back and a face that carried the particular stillness of someone who has decided what she is going to do, regardless of what happens around her. She walked onto the secondary bridge, looked at the 11 officers standing there, assessed the damage, and said, "Who is your senior surviving officer?" I stepped forward. I was not the senior surviving officer. Commander Trevik held that position. But Commander Trevik was standing at the back of the bridge, staring at the dead tactical display, and had not spoken in 6 hours. "Shield Lieutenant Kael Vorethan," I said. Sergeant Dao looked at me. Then she looked at Commander Trevik. Then she looked back at me and nodded, understanding exactly what she was seeing and saying nothing about it. "Shield Lieutenant, I have 6 medics and enough portable life support to stabilize your critical cases. I need you to take me to your wounded." "You're unarmed?" "Yes." "There are 1,100 Vaneth soldiers on this ship. I'm aware. Many of them watched you kill their crewmates 3 hours ago." Sergeant Dao met my eye. She was not brave in the way I understood bravery, the Vaneth concept, which centers on the suppression of fear through willpower. She was brave in a way I had no framework for. She was afraid I could see it, the micro-tension in her jaw, the careful stillness of her hands, and she was here anyway. She had packed the fear into a place where it could not reach her hands, and her hands were what mattered. "Take me to your wounded, Shield Lieutenant, please." I took her. There were 143 critically wounded Vaneth in the medical bay. Dr. Malith had triaged them into 3 groups: those who would live with treatment, those who might live with treatment, and those who would not live regardless. Sergeant Dao walked through the bay once, slowly, looking at each patient. Then she unpacked her team's supplies and said, "We'll start with the ones you've marked as terminal." Dr. Malith stiffened. "Those cases are beyond. I have equipment you don't have, Doctor. Show me the worst." Malith led her to a young enlisted soldier, barely more than a child, 17 standard years old, whose internal organs had been lacerated by shrapnel. Malith had stopped the external bleeding, but the internal damage was catastrophic. On the Imperishable, with its medical bay fully operational, the case would have been survivable. In the Wreckage, without surgical suites or regeneration pods, it was a death sentence. Sergeant Dao knelt beside the patient. She opened a case from her pack and removed a device I didn't recognize, a flat, semi-flexible pad that hummed when activated. She placed it against the soldier's abdomen and studied a readout on her wrist display. "Perforated secondary digestive lining," she said. "Collapsed filtration membrane, hemorrhaging in 3 locations." She looked up at Malith. "Your species' filtration membrane is homologous to our liver. I've been trained on this." "Trained," Malith repeated. "We have 7 Vaneth medical texts in translation and 6 months of comparative xenobiology coursework for every combat medic deploying to this sector." Dao was already working, her hands moving with the assurance of someone who had rehearsed this exact scenario. "Hold this here. Press firmly. Yes, like that." The device hummed. The soldier's vital signs displayed on Mylith's cracked monitor began to stabilize. Mylith watched. Her hands were still steady. Her face was not. "How many can you save?" she asked. "Ask me again in an hour." In an hour, the answer was 11. 11 soldiers pulled from the terminal column and moved to the survivable column by a human combat medic, kneeling on the deck of an enemy warship, using equipment designed to treat alien anatomy she had learned from stolen textbooks. 11 lives. In the context of 250,000 dead, 11 is a number that shouldn't matter. It mattered. The rescue operation lasted 9 days. 9 days of human teams moving through the wreckage field, cutting into derelict hulls, stabilizing compartments, pulling Veneth survivors from pockets of dying atmosphere. They found people in places that should have been impossible: sealed maintenance crawl spaces, cargo containers, the interior of a gun turret where 3 officers had survived by sealing the breech door and sharing a single emergency air bottle for 40 hours. The humans kept count. They posted updates on the open frequency every 6 hours. Number of ships searched, number of survivors recovered, number of dead catalogued. They were recording the names. I learned this on day 4, when a human recovery specialist named Corporal Mende asked me to help identify remains found on Deck 19 of the Imperishable. The bodies were burned beyond visual recognition. Mende had a handheld scanner that could read residual genetic material, but he needed someone who knew the crew roster to match the results. We stood in that charred compartment for 3 hours. I identified 41 bodies. Mende recorded each name, rank, and service number in a database that his suit was transmitting to the human flagship in real time. "Why?" I asked him. Mende looked up from his scanner. He was tall, thin, with the dark skin and angular features of a human ethnic group I didn't know. His expression was patient in a way that didn't condescend. "Because they have families. Their families are in Veneth space. You'll never contact them. We'll hold the records until we can. That could be decades. There may be another war." Mende returned to his scanner. "Then we'll hold them for decades." I watched him work, methodical, gentle with the dead in a way that served no tactical purpose, no strategic objective, no political goal. He positioned each body as if presentation mattered. He cleaned debris from faces where faces remained. "Corporal." "Yes?" "Why didn't you kill us?" He stopped, looked at me not with surprise, but with the expression of someone who had been expecting the question and had not yet decided on the right answer. "The fleet, you mean?" "All of us. Every ship. You had the capability. In 11 minutes you destroyed the most powerful military force in this region of space. You could have left no survivors. It would have been more efficient, strategically safer. We would have been unable to report your capabilities to the Ascendancy. From every tactical perspective, you're asking why we didn't commit genocide." The word hit differently in Veneth than it apparently did in his language. I could see it in his face, the weight he placed on it. In Veneth military doctrine, the total destruction of an enemy force was simply the logical endpoint of engagement. We had a word for it, but it carried no special moral charge. It was arithmetic. Mende set down his scanner. "Because we've done it before," he said, "to ourselves, and we remember what it cost." He picked the scanner up again and returned to his work, and I stood in the burned-out room and felt something shift in my chest that I did not have vocabulary for. On day 6, I went looking for Resk. We'd extracted him from under the strut on day 2. His legs were shattered. The damage was beyond what Dr. Maleth could treat with available resources, but a human orthopedic specialist had stabilized the fractures with an external fixation device that looked brutally functional. Resk was immobilized in the medical bay, conscious and alert, surrounded by Vaneth wounded, being treated by a mixed staff of Vaneth medics and human specialists who had, over 5 days, developed a working protocol that required almost no verbal communication. Maleth would point, Dow would nod, instruments would be exchanged. I sat beside Resk. He looked thinner. The pain medication human supplied, adjusted for Vaneth neurochemistry, kept the worst at bay, but discomfort lived in the lines around his eyes. "You were right," I said. He didn't ask what I meant. "I read the cultural annexes," I continued. "After, I found a working data pad on Deck 4 and pulled the files." Resk turned his head to look at me. "And? They fought 6 nuclear wars. They irradiated their own cities. They poisoned their own atmosphere. They came to the edge of self-extinction 4 separate times." "Yes, and each time they rebuilt, not just the infrastructure, the relationships. They fought their neighbors and then built treaties with them. They committed atrocities and then built courts to try themselves. They invented the technology to destroy their world and then invented the institutions to prevent themselves from using it. Yes, that's not strength the way we define it." Resk reached for his sister's hollow image, which someone had placed on the small table beside his cot. He held it up, studying it as he had in the collapsed targeting room. "No," he said. "It's something else." "What?" "I don't know. I don't think we have a word for it." On day 8, Sergeant Dow found me on the observation deck. Or what had been the observation deck. The blast windows were shattered, covered now by emergency sealant that turned the view into a translucent amber blur. I went there because it was quiet, because through the amber the debris field was softened into something almost abstract, and I could forget for a few minutes that each smear of light was a ship full of people I had served with. Dow sat beside me without asking permission. This was a human behavior I had noticed. They occupied space next to you as an act of solidarity rather than hierarchy. A Veneth officer would have requested formal acknowledgement before entering my immediate proximity. Dow just sat. "We're bringing the imperishable survivors to our medical ship tomorrow," she said. "You'll have full facilities, proper surgery for your friend's legs, regeneration treatment for the burn casualties." "Why are you telling me first?" "Because some of your people won't want to board a human ship, and they'll listen to you before they'll listen to me." She was right. Over 8 days, I had become by default, by the simple mechanism of being willing to speak to the humans when Commander Trevik would not the de facto liaison between the imperishable survivors and the rescue teams. It was not a position I sought. It was a position created by vacuum, like atmosphere rushing into a breach. "I'll talk to them," I said. Dow nodded. She didn't thank me. I appreciated that. Gratitude would have implied I was doing her a favor rather than serving my own people. We sat in silence for a while. Through the amber sealant, I could see the slow pulse of human shuttle lights moving through the debris field, still searching. "Sergeant?" "Yes." "What are you carrying?" She looked at me. "In your pack," I clarified. "Not the medical supplies, not the rations. I've watched your team for 8 days. Every one of you carries something personal. You have a photograph in your left chest pocket. I've seen you touch it 9 times. Corporal Menda carries a small book. Your medic, Torres, has a piece of metal on a cord around her neck. What are they?" Dow was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached into her chest pocket and removed the photograph. It was a small physical image, not a hollow, not a digital display, but actual photographic paper, creased and worn at the edges. It showed 2 children, young, sitting on a wooden structure in an outdoor setting. Behind them, a body of water caught sunlight. The children were laughing. "My kids," Dow said. "Lynn is 7, Tomas is 4. You brought them into a war zone." "I bring them everywhere." "Why?" She held the photograph out as if presenting evidence. "Because I need to remember what the point is." "The point?" "The point of all of it. The training, the deployment, She gestured at the amber-blurred wreckage. "This. I need to remember that the reason I'm sitting in the dark on an alien warship pulling strangers out of rubble is because I have 2 kids on a planet 3 transit jumps from here who are going to grow up in a galaxy that has the Veneth ascendancy in it. And the question is what kind of galaxy that's going to be." She put the photograph away. "I don't hate you, Shield Lieutenant. I'm not angry at you. You came to conquer us because that's what your civilization does, and if we hadn't been able to stop you, you would have. And my kids would have grown up as subjects of your empire, learning your values, being sorted by your criteria, measured, ranked, told their worth was a function of what they could dominate." Her voice was level, not heated, factual. "I have a 4-year-old who cries when insects die, Kael. A 4-year-old who found a damaged bird in our yard and brought it inside and fed it with an eyedropper for 2 weeks until it could fly. That kid, that soft, gentle, completely non-dominant kid would be worthless in your system. Bottom tier, labor caste." I said nothing. "But he's the best thing my species has ever made. Better than the ships, better than the weapons, better than whatever technology just took your fleet apart in 11 minutes. Because the technology, all of it, only exists to keep him safe, to make sure he gets to be exactly what he is without someone telling him it isn't enough." She stood. "That's what we carry, Shield Lieutenant. That's what's in the pack." The imperishable survivors transferred to the human medical vessel Galen on day 9. There were 1,009 of us. We walked those who could walk through a transfer tube from our dead ship into a vessel that hummed with power and warmth and light, and the transition was so stark that several soldiers stopped at the threshold, unable to process the shift from ruin to function. The Galen was not a warship. It was a hospital, dedicated, purpose-built, a vessel that existed for the sole function of healing the wounded. I had never heard of such a thing. In the Vaneth Ascendancy, medical facilities were compartments within warships subordinate to the ship's combat function, allocated space and resources only after weapons, engines, and armor were satisfied. The humans had built an entire ship around the idea that saving the wounded was not a secondary function, but a primary mission. The Galen had a Vaneth wing. I need you to understand what that means. The humans had constructed aboard their own medical vessel, a section specifically designed for Vaneth patients. The atmospheric composition was adjusted. The lighting was shifted to the spectral range comfortable for our visual system. The beds were shaped for our physiology. The signage was an Ascendancy standard. This section had not been built in 9 days. The construction was permanent, structural. It had been designed into the ship's architecture. They had built a hospital wing for us before the war started. I spent 3 days on the Galen processing what I was seeing. Everywhere I looked, there was evidence of preparation that contradicted everything the Ascendancy had taught me about humans. Their medical staff treated our wounded with a competence that came from study, not improvisation. Their translators were fluent, not merely functional, but nuanced, capturing rank implications and social registers that most automated systems flattened. Their xenobiologists knew our anatomy better than many Vaneth field medics. They had spent years learning about us. Not to conquer us, not to exploit us, to be ready. On the 3rd day, I was walking through the Galen central corridor when I passed an open doorway and heard something that stopped me. Music. Not human music, Vaneth music. A traditional composition called The Weight of Standing, which is played at memorial services for fallen soldiers. It is an ancient piece, complex, built on harmonic structures that are specific to Vaneth tonal perception and largely inaudible to most other species. I stepped into the room. A human was sitting alone at a desk, listening to the composition on a small audio device. He was older than most of the soldiers I'd encountered, gray at the temples, lines around the eyes. He wore a uniform with more insignia than I'd seen on any of the rescue personnel. He looked up when I entered, didn't startle, didn't turn off the music. "Shield Lieutenant Vorethan," he said in Vaneth. Not translated, spoken, accented, imperfect, but spoken in my language from a human mouth. "You know my name." "I know the names of all the surviving officers. I've read your service file. You've served with distinction for 9 years, primarily in defensive postings. You requested transfer from the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet before its deployment, denied by Fleet Command." I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with physical vulnerability. "I'm Admiral Chen Wai-Ming," he said. "I commanded the fleet that destroyed yours." I should have felt rage. That is what the Ascendancy would have demanded. That is what every Vaneth cultural narrative prescribed for the moment when a warrior stands before the one who killed his comrades. Rage, controlled and channeled into future action. A cold fire, banked for the day when strength would return and the balance would be restored. I felt something else. I sat down across from Admiral Chen because my legs made the decision before my pride could intervene. And I said, 23 ships. "Yes." "How?" Chen turned off the music. He folded his hands on the desk, a gesture I would later learn was a human signal of candor, of willingness to speak openly. "I'll tell you the technical answer because you're an officer and you deserve it. And then I'll tell you the real answer." I waited. "Technically, it's predictive engagement architecture. Your fleet operated on hierarchical command protocols. Orders flow from the flagship. Execution follows doctrine. Deviation requires authorization. That structure is efficient when it works. It's also fully modelable. We knew your formation before you arrived. We knew your firing solutions before you locked targets. We knew which ships would respond to which stimuli, in what order, at what speed. 23 ships was sufficient because we only needed to solve 23 simultaneous equations. You had 431 ships, but you had one brain." He said this without triumph. "Clinical. That's the technical answer. And the real one?" Chen unfolded his hands. reached into his desk and removed a datapad, placed it between us. The real answer is that we've been watching you for 30 years, Shield Lieutenant. We saw what you did to the Tessari, the Mornith, the Valachi, every species you brought into your client structure. We studied the pattern, and we understood, not hoped, not guessed, understood that you would come for us. He activated the datapad. It displayed a timeline. 30 years of entries, research programs, training initiatives, technological development, diplomatic outreach to the Ascendancy's client species, medical studies of Veneth biology, cultural analysis, language acquisition. 30 years. We spent 30 years preparing for this, Kael. Not for the battle, for this. He gestured at the room, the ship, the Vaneth wing. For the aftermath, because we knew we could destroy your fleet. That was the easy part. The hard part, the part we actually spent 30 years working on, was what to do with you afterward. I stared at the timeline. You could have struck first, I said. If you knew we were coming, you could have come to Vaneth space, hit our shipyards, crippled our fleet before it launched. Yes. It would have been safer, strategically optimal. Yes. Why didn't you? Chen leaned back. The tiredness I'd seen on the face of the first rescuer, Dao's particular flavor of exhaustion was in him too. Deeper, older. The weariness of a man who had carried a 30-year weight and was only now setting part of it down. Because we needed you to choose. If we struck first, we would be the aggressors. Your people would resist. Your client species would rally to your defense, not because they love you, but because they'd fear us more. The war would last decades. Millions would die. And at the end, even if we won, we'd have an empire of fear. We'd be you. He picked up the datapad and turned it off. So we waited. We let you come to us. We let you fire first. We let you establish beyond any possible dispute that you were the aggressor and we were the defender. And then we ended it as fast as we could with as few of your people dead as possible. So that when the histories are written, yours and ours, the record is clean. Clean. We did not want to kill you, Shield Lieutenant. We wanted to show you that you could be stopped. Because a species that believes it cannot be stopped will never choose to stop itself. The Vaneth survivors were held on the Galen for 22 days. Held is perhaps the wrong word. We were not confined. We had access to most areas of the ship. We ate in the same mess halls as the human crew, sat at adjacent tables, walked the same corridors. There were no guards. This was, in itself, the most disorienting thing the humans did. A conquered people should be contained, monitored, controlled. This is basic security doctrine, and the humans were not stupid. They knew perfectly well that 1,100 Vaneth soldiers, many of them physically recovered, posed a genuine threat inside an unarmed medical vessel. And yet, no guards. I asked Dao about it on day 14. She was checking on Resk, whose legs were healing under a regeneration protocol that the human surgeons had adapted from their own technology. She looked at me with that particular expression, not quite patience, not quite amusement. What would you do, Kael, if you overpowered us, took the ship? Then what? We'd have a ship. An unarmed medical ship, 3 transit jumps from home, with no weapons, no charts for human space, and 1,000 wounded aboard. You'd last a week, maybe 2. So it's a calculation. No. She adjusted Resk's fixation device with practiced hands. It's a statement. We're telling you we're not afraid of you, not because we're stronger, you already know that, but because we don't believe you're what your empire says you are. And what does our empire say we are? Conquerors, dominators, a species that only understands force. And what do you believe we are? Dao finished her work and stood. She looked down at Resk, who was watching this exchange with sharp eyes. People. Scared, proud, confused people who were taught that strength is the only thing that matters, by a system that needed them to believe that so it could use them, same as every empire, same as ours once. She left. Resk looked at me. She's describing the Ascendancy the way we describe the client species, he said quietly, kept in line by a system that needs them to stay small. We are not a client species. Not yet, but we are small, Kael. We're very, very small right now. On day 19, something happened that broke the last structural support of who I had been. I was in the Galen's observation lounge, watching human space turn slowly beyond the viewport. A group of Veneth soldiers were clustered in one corner, talking quietly among themselves. They had begun to separate these past weeks into factions that no ascendancy protocol acknowledged. Some wanted to return home and report what they'd seen. Some wanted to remain and understand. Some wanted to forget. A few I knew wanted to die, and were held back only by the stubborn Veneth prohibition against self-termination. The observation lounge had a public access terminal. The humans had left it active, another gesture of trust that felt like an insult until you realized it was the opposite. On that terminal, among other files available in Veneth translation, was a document titled, An Incomplete History of Human Atrocity. The humans had written it themselves. I read it for 6 hours. It was a catalog of every genocide, every mass killing, every systematic cruelty humanity had inflicted on itself across its history. It was written not by victims, but by the species as a whole, in a voice that did not flinch. It named names, it described methods, it provided numbers. It included photographs, real images, not simulations, of human beings doing things to other human beings that I had believed only the Veneth were capable of. The Veneth had client species. The humans had done worse, to their own kind, deliberately, systematically, recently, and they had written it down. They had recorded their own monstrousness, organized it, and placed it on a public terminal for their enemies to read. No species in the Ascendancy's history had ever done this. No Veneth document existed that cataloged our failures, our cruelties, our shames. Such a document would be unthinkable. It would be weakness. It would be handing your enemy the weapon to destroy your legitimacy. The humans had handed it to us freely. I sat in that lounge, and I understood finally the shape of what Resk had said we had no word for. It was not strength, and it was not weakness, and it was not courage exactly, though it required all three. It was the willingness to be seen fully, completely, including the worst of yourself, and to remain standing in the light of that exposure. It was the refusal to hide behind your own mythology. I thought of the Ascendancy, of the histories I had been taught, in which every Veneth action was necessary, every conquest justified, every client species elevated by our administration. Clean, unblemished, heroic. Lies, not the events, the framing. The careful, systematic erasure of every moment when we had been wrong, cruel, excessive, afraid. The Ascendancy's history was not a record. It was an advertisement, and I had been living inside it my entire life, believing I was standing on solid ground, when the ground was paint on air. On day 22, the human fleet escorted the surviving Veneth to the edge of Ascendancy space. There were 4,612 of us, collected from across the debris field, out of 250,000. The humans provided transport ships, repurposed cargo vessels, hastily fitted with Veneth-compatible life support and atmosphere. Not comfortable, but functional, and stocked with supplies for the 2-week transit home. Admiral Chen addressed the survivors via broadcast before departure. He spoke in Veneth. The accent was rough, and he stumbled on 2 words, and he did not apologize for either. You are going home. We are not coming with you. We are not pursuing you. There will be no occupation, no invasion, no terms imposed on your government or your people. What happens in Veneth space is for the Veneth to decide. But I will tell you what I told your shield lieutenant. We have been watching you for 30 years, and we see you. Not the Ascendancy. You. The soldiers who pulled their crewmates from fires. The doctors who worked until they collapsed. The officers who chose order over panic. The individual acts of courage and decency that your empire's structure does not measure and does not reward. You are not what your system says you are. You are more. What you do with that knowledge is not our choice, it's yours. The broadcast ended. I stood on the bridge of a borrowed human cargo ship, surrounded by Veneth officers who had been silent through the address, and I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders, not like a burden but like hands, like someone was standing behind me, pressing down, saying, "This is real, this is your actual mass, stop pretending you are lighter than you are." Resk was beside me. His legs were in braces human-made, fitted perfectly, designed to be removed once Veneth medical facilities could complete the regeneration. He was leaning on a support rail, watching Ascendancy space grow larger in the viewport. "What are you going to tell them?" he asked. "The truth." "Which truth?" I looked at him. "All of it." They'll court-martial you, defeatist rhetoric, undermining martial confidence. You know the statutes. Yes. You'll lose your rank, your status, everything. Resak. Yes. I lost everything 11 minutes into the battle. Everything since then has been finding out what's underneath. He was quiet for a while. Then he tapped his braces, the human engineering that was holding his shattered legs together, that would let him walk again. I'll stand with you, he said. Literally, if these hold up. I want to tell you there was a revolution. That I went home and delivered a speech and the ascendancy crumbled, and a new enlightened Vaineth civilization rose from the ashes of the old. That is the story a human would write, I think, because humans believe in transformation. They believe that a single moment of clarity can redirect a species. That is not what happened. What happened was slow, painful, fragmented. I delivered my report to Naval Command and was immediately arrested. The court-martial lasted 4 days. I was stripped of rank, discharged, and assigned to a labor tier, the lowest caste, the place where the ascendancy put its failures. But the report was heard. By officers who had lost friends in the fleet, by families who had received the human-compiled casualty records accurate, complete, respectful alongside the ascendancy's official tally, which listed the dead as numbers without names, by intelligence analysts who read my account of human technology and understood, with the cold clarity of professionals, that the ascendancy could not win a war against this species, not now, not in 10 years, possibly not ever. By the client species who heard through channels I did not control that the humans had fought a war of precision rather than annihilation, and had built a hospital wing for their enemies before the first shot was fired. Change, when it came, did not come from above. It came from below, from the labor tiers, where the people the ascendancy called failures began to ask why a species that could destroy a fleet in 11 minutes had chosen to spend 9 days pulling survivors from wreckage. From the medical academies, where Dr. Maleth, who returned to a hero's reception for her service on the Imperishable, quietly introduced human comparative xenobiology into her curriculum. From the intelligence service, where analysts began to study not human weapons but human institutions, courts that tried their own leaders, documents that cataloged their own atrocities, systems designed to check their own power. From a young ensign with shattered legs and an admiral's lineage, who walked into the Naval Academy on human-made braces and told a room of cadets that the strongest thing he'd ever witnessed was a 4-year-old boy who cried when insects died. It has been 3 years since the battle. I work in a labor tier on Vainth Prime. I repair atmospheric processors, the machines that keep the air breathable in the lower city levels. It is not prestigious work. It is not measured by the ascendancy's metrics of value. No one will record my name for it. But the air is clean because I make it clean, and the people down here breathe it, and among them are children who have never heard of the Battle of Arcturus and do not know that the man who fixes their air once wore a shield lieutenant's insignia on a dead ship in enemy space. I received a message last month, unsigned, routed through 17 relays, untraceable, written in Vaineth, but with that particular flat cadence that I recognize now the way I recognize my own heartbeat. It said, "Shield Lieutenant, we are still watching, not with weapons, with hope. The wing is still here. The beds are still made. Whenever you're ready." I have not responded yet. I don't know if I will. The ascendancy is slow, and change is not a door you walk through, but a weight you carry uphill, and some days the hill is steeper than others. But I keep the message. I read it on the mornings when the processors are stubborn, and my back aches, and the labor tier feels like exactly what it was designed to feel, like a place where the ascendancy puts its broken things and forgets them. I read it, and I remember a small woman with a photograph in her chest pocket, sitting in the dark on my ship, telling me that the point of everything her species built was a boy who cried when insects died. I read it and I think, the beds are still made. And I go back to work, because the air won't clean itself. And down here, in the lowest level of everything my civilization values, I have found the answer to Resk's question, the word we didn't have for the thing the humans carried. It is not strength. It is not mercy. It is not forgiveness. It is investment. The humans looked at the species that came to enslave them, and they saw not enemies, not assets, not a problem to be solved, but a future worth building for. They spent 30 years preparing not for war, but for what came after war. They designed hospital wings for a people who hated them. They learned our language, our medicine, our music. They recorded our dead by name. They invested in us before we were worth investing in. And now, 3 years later, in a labor tier on Vanth Prime, a broken officer with no rank and no standing repairs the machines that make the air breathable. And he carries a message from the enemy in his pocket. And the message says, "The beds are still made. That is what humanity is." Not the fleet that ended a war in 11 minutes. The hospital wing they built before it started.